This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
You lost all constitutional rights the moment you walked through that door. When the judge sat down there, I sentenced you to 10 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. You walked in that door, you was a number. And the inmates understood that.
If you're out there and they're fast and you're in here, just lay down and do it.
Those inmates that were here in the institution during an execution, it had an impression on them that maybe was still with them to some extent. Maybe they don't think about it anymore, but it had an impression on them, I'm sure.
They wouldn't let me out until I get back to Stinnett. 7 months later, I give it back to them.
That was one of the problems we ran into. Is you had 5 or 6 guys that were sitting in a place, smoking and joking and drinking coffee. Pretty quick, they'd hatched a plan in there to get under your skin some way or try to figure a way out.
Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Behind Gray Walls podcast, a podcast about the old Idaho State Penitentiary and the men and women who lived and worked here. My name's Anthony, and I'm in the new studio that Sam just built. Hey, Sam.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, and we are chatting with Skye out in D.C.
Hello.
Skye, the photos you've been posting online looks like a lot of fun. It's a little heartbreaking seeing you at the games with crutches, but at least it's been an exciting cup, right?
Now listen, we got a lot to update people on.
Yes.
Because we've been gone for a hot minute. And a big part of that was because I injured my other ankle. I tore the Achilles of the opposite ankle that I broke. Now, Anthony, I don't know if you remember last episode.
Yeah.
When we were talking about, finally back playing soccer, this is great.
Uh-huh.
And then do you remember the joke that you made?
Don't hurt yourself.
You said, don't break your other ankle.
Yep.
Which is hilarious. So I guess I didn't break my other ankle, but... that has been a big part of it. I had surgery on May 20th, and I've been kind of, I think we were scheduled to record like the day before my surgery, or maybe it was the day after. I don't remember what it was. So we postponed for that, and then I also had, later, after we had rescheduled, another time or two, had my computer die on me. So those are the reasons that I have been gone. And anyway... So then prior to my injury, my parents and I had gotten tickets to go to the World Cup in Kansas City, and we saw the last group stage games for a couple of the last groups. So we saw Netherlands and Tunisia, which was so fun. Wow. Netherlands won pretty easily, but by the time we were recording this, it's now the round of 32, and they, I guess hopefully not spoiler alert by this point, but they have been knocked out, which was very sad. And then... We saw the very, very last group game of the whole tournament, Austria-Algeria, which was so much fun, ended crazy wild 3-3 tie. And because of my injury, I wore my boot all over Kansas City. I had a crutch, and we were able to get more accessible seats, and they ended up being right behind the goal where the Algerian fans were.
Wow.
So that was a ton of fun. This World Cup has been so much fun. So that actually has been... hopefully something, if you guys are into soccer, if listeners are into soccer or football, hopefully that has been a little something to keep you slightly entertained, just a little bit, while we have been gone. So, yes, that has been a great time, but also not as great of a time.
Yeah. Oh, Skye, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry if I jinxed you.
No. It's okay. I, struggle to make sense of it all, but, at this point it is what it is, and I'm on the mend, so, yeah.
Do you have an idea of, like, when you'll be up and running again?
So I can put weight on my feet or my foot if it's in a boot, and I'm currently at recording about 6 weeks out from surgery, and I think I have to be in a boot for 4 more weeks. And I can't drive because it's my right foot until I'm out of my boot, which is tough. So back fully on my feet, hopefully soon. Like, I'm hoping I can start to give small tours here very soon. But yeah, it's quite the bummer. So that is part of why we haven't been gone for so long, but we are back. With what is ostensibly kind of a season finale. I don't know if we've really had a season. It's just been kind of releasing what we can when we can.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I promise we'll get back to actually having regular output, regular seasons in the future. We have just been very busy with future projects, and we'll talk more about it with y'all later this summer and fall.
Skye, I'm so sorry. It's heartbreaking. It really
No,
is.
thanks. Yeah, it's been a bummer, but all good. Could have been worse. I'll probably not be playing soccer for a while, if maybe ever. Again, but it is. I'm over 30 now, so I'm practically ancient in sports terms.
Yeah.
Man, getting old's great.
Yeah, it is for sure. Well, should we get to our stories?
I think
Let's do
we
it.
should, and I think
Okay.
we should let you start today.
All right. Well, most injured goes first. So, so today I am talking about number 11234, Elizabeth Levita Grant. This isn't a particularly wild crime, again, because this was like kind of a finale, kind of not. Anthony, of course, will have a stunning story in terms of like all the crazy things that happen, but she does have some interesting stuff about her. So sources today are her inmate file from the Idaho State Archives, newspapers.com records, ancestry.com records, EBSCO research page on Chief Whitebird, information about Chief Whitebird from lapway.org, pages on the Nez Perce War of 1877 from the National Park Service website, Farragut Naval Training Station by Darby Pierce from intermountainhistories.org, a page titled Idaho Legacy, Farragut, Idaho from the Idaho Military Museum at museum.mil.idaho.gov, an article titled Midway, Momentum and Manpower, the Navy's Bureau of Personnel in World War II by MC1 Mark D. Ferrum, the Farragut Naval Training Station by Bob Gunter at what I think is the blog at sandpoint.com, the Idaho Population Census data from census.gov, TB incidence and mortality chart from cdc.gov, an article titled Idaho Broadens Ban on Interracial Marriage, March 1, 1921, found on Equal Justice Initiative, which is eji.org, Loving v. Virginia at supreme.justia.com, the 14th Amendment explanation at the Constitution annotated website, constitution.congress.gov, and then quick information from Wikipedia and its sources about the Farragut Naval Training Center, David Farragut, Farragut State Park, and anti-miscegenation laws in the United States. So Elizabeth Levita Grant was born Elizabeth Whitebird on May 1st, 1922 in Lapway, Idaho on the Nez Perce Reservation. She was the youngest of three kids born to James Whitebird and Bertha Powicki Whitebird. They're both members of the Nez Perce tribe. Elizabeth's oldest sibling was 12 years older than her, and her middle sibling was 10 years older, so she's quite a bit younger. And according to newspaper reports, her paternal grandfather was a famous and influential chief of the Nez Perce named Chief Whitebird. Sometimes his name is translated as White Goose or White Pelican, but it does seem like Whitebird is a name that we're actually, I think, familiar with. There is up in the northern part of the area. Isn't there a Whitebird, Idaho, I think, somewhere? So starting in 1855, we've kind of talked a lot about the Nez Perce War. So just to kind of give you, again, a quick overview and talk more specifically about how Whitebird is involved. So starting in 1855, the territorial governor of the Oregon Territory, which at this point, what is now the state of Idaho, is still kind of part of this, met with representatives from several tribes, including the Nez Perce or the Nimipu. The native tribes negotiated the ceding of millions of acres to tribal lands to the territorial governments, but they were able to retain hunting and fishing rights in their traditional places. And then, as we know, once gold is discovered within the boundaries of the reservation, the U.S. government calls for another treaty council, and then this shrinks the reservation that they were first given by about 90%. So the Treaty of 1863, which is the treaty that really, tries to shrink this reservation, is opposed by a handful of Nez Perce band leaders, including Whitebird. So he is one of the Nez Perce who refused to sign the treaty. Eventually, this treaty itself is going to remove the Nez Perce to the current reservation as we know it today. And so Whitebird is also very importantly involved in the first battle of the Nez Perce Flight in 1877, which again talked about several times, but U.S. troops pursue the Nez Perce bands who would refuse to sign the treaties, and so Whitebird is leading one of the groups that are trying to flee to Canada. And in June 1877, Whitebird led a band of about 600 warriors, along with Chief Joseph, against the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army at this time is led by a guy named Captain David Perry. So although Perry deployed multiple companies against the warriors, the Nimiipuu tactically held their ground and forced the army to retreat. So this is, of course, a massive victory. Whitebird was with Chief Joseph in the final 5-day battle of the Nez Perce War, which was the siege at Bear Paw in what is now the state of Montana. And by the time this battle was being fought, the Nez Perce bands led by Chief Joseph and Whitebird had already fled over 1,100 miles to escape the U.S. Army. Now, as we know, most of the Nez Perce are caught prior to slipping into Canada. Of course, had they gotten into Canada, they are outside of United States jurisdiction. But Whitebird leads a small number that are able to slip past the U.S. Army and actually get into Canada. Once in Canada, he meets up with the Lakota leader Sitting Bull with about 300 others. And at this point, then some of the Nimiipuu warriors joined with Sioux warriors, and they camped with Sitting Bull in Canada. But as I mentioned, about 400 Nimiipuu led by Chief Joseph were forced to surrender to the army and cede their lands. Though they expected to be able to return to their homelands, instead the army sent them on yet another long, arduous journey, first to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, and then many of them would be exiled to what was then called Indian Territory. Today we would know it as Oklahoma. And these groups, who for hundreds of years had lived in what we now know as the Pacific Northwest, they would not be allowed to return to this place for 7 years. And once they were, some went to the Nez Perce Reservation in Idaho, some to the Colville Reservation in Washington State. But because Whitebird is able to escape to Canada, he settles with his family in Alberta, and he actually never returns to the United States. Sadly, he was murdered about 5 years later, Whitebird, by another Nez Perce man whose children had died from an illness after Whitebird, who was a healer, had treated them. And so, unfortunately, in a fit of grief and sorrow, this man whose children died, he got his revenge on Whitebird. So this is the lineage that Elizabeth comes from. The Whitebird family, of course, lived on the Nez Perce Reservation. Elizabeth, her parents, her older sister, Ida. Indian census rolls, just as a side note, list her sister's name as Josephine, but her family records name her Ida. And then Elizabeth also had an older brother named Lewis. Now, Ida and Lewis were from Bertha's first marriage, her mother's first marriage, so that's why they were 10 and 12 years older. Sadly, Elizabeth's mother, Bertha, died on January 31st, 1924 from pneumonia when Elizabeth was just about a year and a half. Just a few years later, in January 1927, just before Elizabeth was 5 years old, sadly, her father also died. And the Deseret News from Salt Lake City, Utah, reported on his death, and this was reported on February 1st, 1927, quote, James Whitebird, son of the famous Chief Whitebird, danced himself into the next world in a medicine dance held by tribesmen at Webb. Whitebird, 60 years of age, a perfect physical specimen and a splendid type of Nez Perce, would not be outdanced by any of his tribesmen, young or old. He was seized with a heart attack shortly after completing one of the prolonged dances of the evening and died immediately, end quote. This article would also go on to say, quote, Whitebird was one of the finest types of Nez Perce, and his wonderful and straight body was always clothed in the finest of garbs, end quote. At 5 years old, Elizabeth is an orphan. But she's not alone, as her maternal great-aunt, who she actually called a grandmother named Minnie, took her and her brother into her home. Minnie's son Harry, who Elizabeth called an uncle, also lived with them, and Harry's wife would join a few years later. So from what I can piece together, her family generally tried their best to raise her and her siblings as well as they could, and doing it all together. And as far as I understand, family at every level is a central and core unit among the Nimiipuu, and so it makes sense, of course, that many, many family members pitched in. Elizabeth would later say that growing up, she felt her grandmother was too strict, but in retrospect, quote, she did her best to bring Elizabeth up in the right way, end quote, and had treated her well. She also had briefly lived with her Uncle Harry and his wife, but she kind of, would just bounce back and forth between various familial households. In August 1936, at age 14, she married another Nez Perce member, a man named Ray White, in Lapwai. The marriage record stated her age as 16, but 1936, based on the records we have, would make her 14. Understandably, getting married at 14 is not exactly a recipe for success, and this marriage does not last long because by 1940, just 4 years later, the census records place her living with her brother Louis, his wife Eva, and then their sister Josephine, or Ida. Now, she herself reported that after only a couple months of living with her brother, she then returned to her grandmother's house. And her brother later told her that the marriage had ended because her grandmother had annulled it, claiming that Elizabeth had been so young, which, to be honest, is fair. By 1940, she and her family are living in Nespelem, Washington, which is located on the Colville Indian Reservation. But 1942 would prove to be a difficult year for Elizabeth, as well as roughly for the United States, which we'll get into here in just a second. So first, in 1942, she was arrested for the very first time in Spokane, Washington for vagrancy under the name Juanita Elwell, and she was fined $5. Next, in 1942, her grandmother, who, as we know, had essentially raised her, died. Then, in August, her older brother Louis, who worked on the Farragut Naval Training Station, was killed in an accident. Very sadly, according to the Spokesman Review, Louis had been trying to cross a 4-lane highway between the naval station and a small town to the east called Othel, which the road was actually under construction. And as a truck barreled toward Louis, he jumped out of the way only to have the truck accidentally veer right into where he was jumping. And the cause of his death was listed as a fractured skull. Now, the Farragut Naval Training Center, where Louis had been working, is a really interesting piece of Idaho history. We have covered it in the past, all the way back in Season 6, which would have been, 40 plus episodes ago. So it's worth a quick revisit. So on December 7th, 1941, the United States was rocked, of course, when the news broke that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. By 1942, enlistments in the Navy swelled to record numbers. Nearly 200,000 men had enlisted in the Navy by June of 1942, so just 7 months later. So with those numbers, there quickly rose a need for more training facilities, and by March 1942, the government announced they had chosen the area around Lake Pend Oreille to be the site of a new Navy station. By May, President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself had named this new site, calling it Farragut after the Union Admiral David G. Farragut. And David Farragut was the first admiral in the U.S. Navy and is remembered for his famous and altered exclamation, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," which he said during the Battle of Mobile Bay during the Civil War. So that's who it's named after. So the training station was built on the southern end of Lake Pend Oreille, located between the towns of Sandpoint and Coeur d'Alene in the state's panhandle, all the way up north. Now, why this area of all places? Well, it's 300 miles inland from the west coast, which, of course, many thought was vulnerable to another Japanese attack or, worse, an invasion. Also, building the base on the shore of a deep and long lake allowed for training in ocean-like conditions without the risk of training in the real open ocean. Within 9 months of naming the base, it was officially opened, hosting 55,000 recruits. Now, according to the available census data, the largest city in Idaho at the time that this opens, which of course is Boise, had just over 26,000 residents. So this is double the size of Boise at the time, and by further contrast, the two closest cities, Coeur d'Alene has about 10,000 residents, and Sandpoint only had about 4,000. So people are pouring into this area. But the movement of the base into the area also brought, of course, jobs, business, and, of course, very importantly, eligible bachelors to the area. And many locals remember the base being a boon for nearby towns, really helping the economy. So here at the Farragut Training Center, new recruits learned how to swim, row, march, and shoot before being sent to either the Mediterranean or the South Pacific. In 1945, the base also became a prisoner of war camp, where almost 900 German POWs were held and where they worked as manual laborers like gardeners and maintenance workers. One Lewiston Morning Tribune report from 1945 stated that the German POWs removed 8 inches of snow from the base's football field when the University of Idaho Vandals football team visited to play the Farragut Sailors. It was the German POWs' job to clear the field so that the Vandals and the Farragut football teams could play. The last recruit class graduated from Farragut in March 1945, and the facility was decommissioned by 1946. But, so not open for a long time, but within its 30 months of existence, it trained nearly 300,000 sailors and waves, which are the women's branch of the U.S. Navy. Farragut was the second largest training center in the world, and the first was the naval station Great Lakes near Chicago. It was essentially its own city. It had mess halls, libraries, movie theaters, and chapels, and it received recruits from 24 of our then 48 states. So massive numbers, again, just people pouring in and out of this area all of the time. After its decommissioning, it operated briefly as a vocational college, and then the land was kind of handed back and forth between the state and the federal government until in 1966 became Farragut State Park. So you can do all the things at Farragut State Park you can do at any other state park, like hiking, camping, swimming, water sports, horseback riding, mountain biking, pretty much anything you would want. The Farragut State Park also has one remaining military building. It was the confinement facility, which is kind of funny given that this is the prison podcast. But the confinement facility now hosts what they call the Museum at the Brig. And this includes displays of its military history and some historic prison cells.
I want to check that out. Yeah. I would love to see that.
Yeah, I haven't been. Sam, have you been to Farragut?
No, I would love to see it.
Yeah, so I've not been up there, I've been up there, but not to that area. So that was just a quick rabbit hole. So again, I bring this up because sadly, 1942, her brother, who was stationed there, gets hit by a truck and dies. Oh. So back to Elizabeth, 1942, really tough year. 1943 and 1944, she spent in Portland, Oregon. She was arrested 3 times within about 7 months for drunkenness, vagrancy, and disorderly conduct. And throughout these arrests, she's arrested under the names Elizabeth Lovita White and Elizabeth Lovita Gutierrez. And she's given penalties anywhere from a $25 fine to 30 days in jail. Documents also stated that during the war years, she worked in Portland as a welder in the shipyards. And then again in my notes, I said, hello, women working in factories during World War II. This is what I study. I love this stuff. Okay. So in 1946, the war is over by now, but she's arrested again for drunkenness. And also throughout this time, between 1943 and 1946, she lived with various men on and off, often taking their last names, even though they were never formally married. So Gutierrez is an example of that. And so because the marriages aren't formal, it is hard to verify who the husbands, boyfriends, partners were. One we know for sure is a man named Pete Alvarez, with whom she lived in Yakima, Washington. Alvarez was probably from Mexico from what I could find about him, but we don't really know much else. So we're a couple years out of the war, and in June 1947, as her situation continues to be a little bit unstable, her drinking continues to be a problem. On June 26th, the Spokane Chronicle reported that she, under the name Elizabeth Whitebird Alvarez, and another woman named Inez Ezekiel were warned and released by police for being drunk. 2 days later, on the 28th of June, the Spokesman Review reported that Elizabeth Whitebird Alvarez had been stabbed during what the paper calls a drinking party. Again, not many other details in the newspaper, like who she was stabbed by or why. So this is all she really said about it after she entered the penitentiary. She said that she had been stabbed on the left side of her chest after she had got in the way, quote unquote, between two men who were fighting. So rough and tumble crowd that she's probably living with, going out with, whatever the case is. After being stabbed, she went to the hospital, but only after the wound she had received was more serious than she originally thought. The newspaper doesn't ever later report her condition, but obviously she lives. Pete Alvarez, her alleged husband, was being held in the county jail for battery at this very same time, but it was unclear if his charge and her injury were the same incident or not. She apparently heals up enough from her stabbing wound that just a couple months later, in August, she is again arrested in Yakima for drunkenness. And then the same crime in the same place exactly 1 year later, as well as in November 1948 for drunkenness and disorderly conduct in Spokane. So, tough. 40s, not a great decade for her. So around 1948 or 1949, she begins living with a man named Tony Sanchez, and the couple lived in Oregon. Now, 1949, after a tough decade, was a good year for her. It included the birth of her son Anthony in October 1949, which is an approximate, we don't know the exact date of his birth. But the 1950 census lists the small family of Tony, Elizabeth, and Anthony living in Umatilla, Oregon, along with a boarder in the house. Not long after, according to her, she and Tony essentially separated and, quote-unquote, just drifted apart, which was what she said in her own words. She maintained custody of her son in this drifting apart, and the separation may not have been totally complete over the next few years because documents and things kind of connect her with him over the next year or so after she says they broke up. And after their breakup, unfortunately, she does go back to her old ways. So in April 1950, she's arrested in Pendleton, Oregon, again for drunkenness. A month later, in May 1950, again arrested for drunkenness, this time in Yakima, Washington. Then, about a year later, in June 1950, Elizabeth and another woman named Thelma Smith were arrested with a man who gave the name Wilbur Smith, presumably Thelma's husband. The three of them were charged with vagrancy, given 10 days in jail, but had their sentences suspended for time that they had already served. Then, in a curious coincidence, or perhaps more likely because the two crimes were related, Tony Sanchez, Elizabeth's common-law husband, was arrested for drunk driving. So she is charged with vagrancy, and then her husband, that same time, arrested for drunk driving, and then they were found with another couple. So the perhaps assumption here is that it was sort of like a double date kind of thing, and they had been out perhaps drinking too much. He was clearly driving drunk. No one do that. Please do not do that. So I couldn't find anything in an article, any articles that said anything about Tony's arrest. I was just able to use prison records to confirm that he had been arrested on that very same day. So they were all given 10 days, but had their sentences suspended for time served. But actually, the women had one other punishment. They were forced to pay the juvenile department in order to keep custody of their own children. So in other words, they're all given 10 days, but have their sentence suspended for time served, but the two women are forced to pay the juvenile court so that they don't have their children taken away from them. And Anthony's just a year and a half old at this point, 18 months. Tiny baby, very much needs his mother. After her arrest at the Idaho State Penitentiary, she actually cried while telling the authorities about this event in her life, the fact that she was told, you pay money or you lose your child. And she actually would go on to say she had been accused unfairly of drinking, that she had actually been attending Alcoholics Anonymous at the time of her arrest. And so the fact that she lost her son because she couldn't pay to keep him, which is exactly what happened, this was a very traumatic event for her. This, it seems, according to authorities, is really the only time that she showed this kind of emotion was when she was talking about losing her son. And in in her eyes, being accused of drinking when she actually had been working really hard to fix it. Now, of course, this is her account of the crime, but that, according to her, is what happens. And it is really gut-wrenching that she lost her son because she didn't have the money to basically pay the juvenile department, and it was taken away from her, perhaps unfairly. And so, perhaps understandably, after she loses her son, she starts drinking again. So if she had been in the process of getting better, this undoes all of it. Then, which of course leads to making it harder to get him back from the authorities. And she would never be able to get back into contact with him, at least up until the point that she entered the prison in Boise, which is tragic. So the next few years were likely a blur of jobs and moves and probably drinking. In the early 1950s, she had relocated to Los Angeles, where she had participated with the American Indian group of AA, but again, doesn't quite stick. She's arrested twice for drunkenness while she's living in LA, first in November 1952, then in May 1953, and this is under the name Elizabeth Louita Five Killer. She briefly returned to Oregon, where she was again arrested for drunkenness in Pendleton. She's then back in California in the year of 1955, and with the name Elizabeth Lovita Sanchez, she's arrested for two other things besides drunkenness. First, petite theft in Sacramento, and then disturbing the peace in Stockton within days of each other in March of 55. Both of these charges were dismissed. But then over the next 7 months, she's arrested twice in Stockton and once in Los Angeles for, say it with me, drunkenness. During one of her arrests, she had been arrested with a man named Carmel Tackett, who was arrested and charged with being drunk in or about an automobile. Then, in November 1955, The Record, which is a newspaper from Stockton, California, reported that Elizabeth had been hit by a car. Or that was what she told the doctors at the emergency room, but she was unable to say where she'd been hit or how it had happened. Given the tendencies that we've seen in her story so far, I think the insinuation here is that she was drunk when she got hit by the car and wasn't able to tell a cohesive story. But then, in a completely unexpected turn, she completely disappears from authorities' radars for the next several years. There is noted on her Bertillon, there is a big, enormous scar on the left side of her torso. It starts under the armpit, and it goes front to back all the way to kind of the middle of her back. And according to the sources I looked at to figure out, what lobectomy was, sometimes that can even mean the removal of a rib, like halfway down your torso with this lobectomy. So that's why she is off of authorities' radar. So over the next few years, she lives a quiet life. And in fact, she has the longest stretch of non-arrests in almost 20 years in the late 1950s. But sadly, she is arrested for drunkenness in Lewiston using the last name Whitebird in July 1961. Now, one of the things that she does over the years that authorities don't have track of her is she met a man named Charles Edward Grant. Charles was a divorced father of 3 who had worked in the lumber industry in northern Idaho. He was now working as a part-time bartender. Eventually, the two fell in love and married in 1962. Now, we should say it is unclear if this marriage was another common law marriage or an official one. No records one way or the other. But the thing that was most notable about Charles Grant, at least in relation to Elizabeth, is that he was a white man. And of course, Elizabeth is Nez Perce woman. So marriages between a white person and a person of color, which includes Indigenous Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans at this time, it had been illegal just 3 years before they married. Laws against interracial marriage, these are called anti-miscegenation laws. These had been on the books in Idaho since 1864. And one of the laws included a law that banned, quote unquote, interracial cohabitation. So even living together was punishable. And punishment for breaking these laws included fines anywhere between $100 and $500 and imprisonment ranging from 6 months to 2 years. In 1867, the Idaho legislature increased the maximum prison time for marrying someone of a race different than yours to 10 years. The Idaho legislature finally repealed the anti-miscegenation laws. Do you guys want to guess when they do it?
The 1970s?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
60s?
Close, 1959. So the U.S. Supreme Court would declare anti-miscegenation laws unconstitutional 8 years later in 1967 with the ruling of Loving v. Virginia. Real quickly, this was an interracial couple, an African-American woman named Mildred Jeter and a white man named Richard Loving. They lived in Virginia where interracial marriage was illegal. So they went to D.C. where it was legal. They got married. They returned to Virginia and they were charged with violating these laws. They were given 1 year in jail, but a judge suspended their sentence for 25 years on the condition that they leave the state that they were from. So eventually the case makes its way to the Supreme Court, which overturned their conviction. This is a conversation happening in the country, even though in the state of Idaho, these laws are off the books. This is still being had in the United States as late as the 1960s, which is not that long ago.
So, you get the jail time and the fine, and do they annul your marriage, or you continue to be married to this person, but you've
That's
been
a good
punished?
question. I think it would depend on the state. I would think because they get married in D.C., so then I think the assumption is, well, it's legal in D.C., so I don't think you can annul it where it is legal, but I don't know. It's a good question.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So,
I'm loving these rabbit holes, Skye. This is so
good.
Cool.
Very interesting.
It's all I got these days. So even though, these anti-miscegenation laws are off the books by the time of their marriage, their marriage raised enough eyebrows that authorities included that detail in her social history and in their notations after she entered the Idaho State Penitentiary. Less than a year into her marriage, however, Elizabeth finally broke her crime-free streak. Back in Lewiston, she was arrested in December 1962 for disorderly conduct. Then, on January 18th, 1963, in Lewiston, she cashed a check worth $20 at a local grocery store, making a purchase and then taking the rest of the check in cash. The check was made out to Elizabeth Whitebird and was signed with the name Ira K. McIntosh. The check, of course, was written by Elizabeth herself, and as we know, this is called forgery. She later admitted she had forged one other check, but she later picked up that second check, and so she wasn't prosecuted on it. She also admitted, drunk when she had written out the checks. Apparently, she had been arrested a few days after writing the check, originally for drunkenness, and was held in the city jail until her charge of forgery was made, at which time she was transferred to the Nez Perce County Jail. So the girl can't really catch a break. So she's originally arrested for drunkenness, and then they say, oh, wait a minute, we have this check that seems suspicious. We're just going to hold you here. Then once she's charged with forgery, they transfer her to the county jail. So the Nez Perce prosecuting attorney claimed that Elizabeth was in the midst of a quote-unquote drinking spree when she committed the crime, but also said that she'd always seemed to be aware of what she had done wrong. So she never tried to say, I don't remember. She always seemed to accept the responsibility. So she pleaded guilty and was given a 3-year sentence at the Idaho State Penitentiary. Now, she and another female inmate named Claire Lopez, who, again, I covered in Season 6, they were both convicted of forgery in Nez Perce County and given 3 years, so they were transported down to Boise together. So Elizabeth Levita Grant entered the Idaho State Penitentiary on March 12th, 1963. As we mentioned, she entered with Claire Lopez and another woman who was in for a check-related crime named Estella Wilson. I covered her in Season 7. She was actually in for issuing a no-account check, which is a little different than forgery. The 3 of them made up 8 women in the women's ward, and in fact, one of them was Lucille Haram, who I just covered, I believe, last episode, which seems like it was a million years ago. So her intake form, sex, female, of course, race, Nez Perce Indian, age 40, nationality American, birthplace Lapwai, Idaho, eyes brown, hair black, height 60 inches, so 5 feet even, weight 103, complexion brown Indian, build small, deformities none, Vaccinated, no. Tattoo, 1. Drink, yes. Smoke, yes. Gamble, no. Drugs, none. Her religious denomination is listed as Methodist, and she considered herself a member rather than having it just be a preference. Her education was listed as 7th grade, and she had last attended in the Lapwai public school system in Lapwai. She listed her occupation as housewife and her residence in Idaho, 20 years. Now, her Bertillon is pretty covered now. As I mentioned, she has that big scar, like I said, kind of starts under her armpit, goes all the way up the back, and it is listed on her Bertillon as a lobectomy scar. She's got big stab wound scars on her chest that are noted. It also noted that her earlobes had been pierced for earrings, which you don't always see on women's Bertillons. Scars on her face. It also says no teeth, which is fortunate if that's the case. And then her tattoo is on the outside of her right forearm, and it says Lovie Lonnie, Lovie, Lonnie, Lonnie. Now, we don't know who Lonnie is, but she is a tattoo girly. Now, as is so often the case, especially with forgers and those who commit check-related crimes, we don't have too much information about her time in prison. We can assume that meant her behavior was good, if unremarkable. And also, we should mention that the women's ward got incredibly full throughout the year of 1963. Now, as I mentioned, when Elizabeth entered in March, she made up one of 8 inmates. By the end of the year, 8 more women entered, so this makes a total of 16 inmates. Now, as we know, there is space comfortably for about 14 people, so by 16, they would have been moving beds out into the main area. So imagine going in and only being in prison for like a year, and you have double your population come in. That would get claustrophobic so quickly. So probably because the prison was filling up and because of her unremarkable / good behavior, she was granted parole on December 11th, 1963, effective on February 12th, 1964. And she was indeed released on parole that day. So after her release, she returned to Lapwai to live with her husband Charles, who had recently lost his job as a bartender at a local bar, but he seemed dedicated to helping her make the best adjustment back into her regular life. She had a tiny bit of income because she owned some land in Grangeville, Idaho, and had a renter on the property, but all of those plans, well, none of them happened. And that's because by March 25th, less than 2 months after her release, Elizabeth's parole officer had already reported back to the director of state parole and probation, declaring that not only had she already been arrested for drunkenness, she had been arrested for drunkenness twice since being released on her parole. She had first been arrested on March 16th and given a 5-day sentence in the city jail, and this arrest her officer had not been notified of. And so she's released after the 5 days, and literally 1 week after her first arrest, she is arrested again on March 23rd and given a 3-day sentence. This one, her officer is notified of, and so he places a parole violation warrant on her. And she told him that she didn't want to sign the admission of her violation until she could talk to her husband. But then she also said that he hadn't visited her while she was being held in city jail and wasn't sure he would come soon. And she had tried to call him with her call that she had gotten one of the days she was there, but no one had answered. And so she was saying, well, I don't want to admit to this until I can talk to my husband. But then it seems, according to her husband is giving her the cold shoulder. Her parole officer said that he was doubtful she would stop her excessive drinking and was afraid she'd start writing checks again because neither she nor her husband had a job. And so she was returned to the penitentiary as a parole violator on March 31st, 1964, less than 60 days after her release on parole. After her second incarceration, she decided she didn't just want to get released on parole, she wanted to serve enough time to be granted a final release. And so a final release just means she serves her entire sentence, which means she can be released without supervision. But if she is released on parole, which she learned, parole required supervision. And once she decided to serve out the whole length of her sentence, she was cooperative. She started taking speed writing and typing classes to quote-unquote better herself when she leaves here. Matron Lulu Rowan also reported that Elizabeth's outlook on life had greatly improved since she had returned. And just about a year after her return, she was granted final release effective May 4th, 1965. And she was indeed released on that day, May 4th, 1965. She actually only served 2 years of her 3-year sentence. And this could be because over the year that she had returned to the prison, so between 64 and 65, again, 12 women had entered the prison and only about 10 left. So 1, really high turnover, and 2, it's pretty full. So according to official reports, she expected to return home to Lapwai to help take care of her husband, who was ill. It was also reported, rather happily, that she had managed to get in touch with her son, Anthony, who was 16 years old at this point, and she expected him to come visit after his year of school was out, which I think is really nice. Now, unfortunately, the last record that we have of her is her death record, and this comes less than 4 years after her release from prison. She died on February 15th, 1969, at just 46 years old. Now, her death record stated that she died of a subdural hematoma, and that is when blood pools underneath the layer of tissue between your skull and your brain. And this is an injury that is often a result of a head injury of some kind. Interestingly, her death record didn't include what kind of injury this resulted from, and in fact, the boxes that asked when and how the injury occurred only contained question marks. On this death record, the doctor stated he had attended her between February 11th and February 15th, which would indicate the fatal condition had worsened over several days. The place of injury, as in like where the space in which it had happened, like not where on the body the injury was, the doctor circled the option home, but there are no other details. Extra curiously, in the box that asked if the death had been an accident, suicide, or homicide, there is a slight line under homicide with a question mark next to it. So, a curious death that is not known, doesn't appear perhaps to have been looked into. I don't know. I'm curious about it, but obviously there's no other details. So, her obituaries appeared in the Spokane Chronicle newspaper and the Spokesman Review newspaper. These state that she was survived by her son, Tony, which I think means that they were in touch by then, which I'm so glad to hear. Also survived by her sister, Josephine or Ida, as well as 3 aunts whose names were Annie Owaihe, Jeanette Cleveland, and Hattie Redstar. Her aunts had actually all been present with their father, Elizabeth's grandfather, Whitebird, when he escaped to Canada to join Chief Joseph. And she was buried in the Jonah Cemetery, sometimes called the Sweetwater Cemetery in Sweetwater, Idaho. And the cemetery is often used for burials for many Nimupu people like Elizabeth Lovita Grant.
Wow.
And so that is our story.
That was sad.
Yeah, that like constant struggle with the addictions to alcohol.
Yeah.
I bet a lot of listeners have family or know somebody who struggles with that, and it's just so prevalent. And oh man, to get away from it and be able to stay away from something that is just so part of our culture. Oh, that's yeah.
I think addictions are hard to shake in the best of circumstances, let alone in really tough circumstances with her boy being taken away and then having all of these cards stacked against her. That makes it even harder to overcome something like that.
Wow, what a scary, mysterious death, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, when I found that death record, I was like, oh, that's wild. But I could not find any details anywhere about it. So, yeah, very curious and mysterious.
Was she still married to the white man when she died?
No, I don't believe so. As far as I could tell, they had separated at some point. But again, common law, so hard to pinpoint one way or the other.
Yeah. Nice. Well, good job, Skye.
Oh, thank you.
Hi everyone, this is your events and rentals team at the Old Idaho Penitentiary.
Did you know you can rent out one of Idaho's most iconic historic sites for your next event? The Old Idaho Penitentiary offers a truly unforgettable setting for meetings, corporate events, wedding ceremonies and receptions, proms, birthday parties, and so much more.
Whether you're planning something elegant, educational, or unique, our historic buildings and scenic grounds provide a one-of-a-kind backdrop your guests will never forget. We work closely with you to help bring your vision to life while preserving the incredible history of the site.
For more information, visit history.idaho.gov/rentals.
Now, unfortunately, I hear you may have an even sadder one for us, Anthony.
Yes, I have to put on a ton of listener discretions here. I touch on brutal murder, some sexual assaults, and suicide. So please, listeners, this is definitely adult-only episode, and if you are sensitive to these subjects, like, this is not a good episode for you. But this is something that we've alluded to this story many times throughout the podcast history, and we talk about him on occasion during our darker tours and darker events, talking about some of the real dark parts of the prison's history. So definitely listener discretion advised for this next bit.
And even if you have a high tolerance for this stuff, take your emotional temperature as you're listening. There's no fault in skipping or pausing or whatever you need to do.
Absolutely. So I am covering Earl Boan, number 9599. Now, Earl David Boan was born in 1935 in Chesterfield, South Carolina. His childhood was fraught with issues. His grandmother's surname was Outlaw, which happens to be a pretty common name in the Carolinas. I was like, wow, that's interesting. And
that's sick.
Yeah. She married into the Boan family and had Earl's father, David Cornelius Boan, in 1915. Earl's father was a bit of an outlaw himself, and his story ends rather tragically. So before we get to that, David and Earl's mother, Ethel L. Jordan, met sometime in the early 1930s. And I couldn't find any marriage records, but it was reported that his parents married in October 1934 in Darlington, South Carolina. Ethel gave birth to Earl on July 31st, 1935. And from my research, Earl's father, David, abandoned the family and lived up to his outlaw family name. In 1935, 2 months after Earl was born, David was arrested in Columbus, South Carolina, along with 3 other men under a charge of arson after burning the Pond Hollow School, this school building near Hartsville, over a, quote, dispute between 2 factions in the community over the employment of teachers, end quote. I was like, what does that mean? Do they not like the folks that were...
It's Romeo and Juliet, but for the local school teachers.
Yeah. There's so much that goes on at this school. So the building was destroyed at a loss of $2,300, and I couldn't find any further details about why the fire was set, but it wasn't the first time the schoolhouse was burned down. David and the other 3 men were released on their bonds set at $750 each, and I couldn't find any follow-up jail time or time in prison or anything like that. 2 years later, in March 1937, David was arrested and held on a $400 bond for grand larceny with the theft of 4,000 yards of cloth from a bleachery in Hartsville. David and his partner in crime worked at the bleachery and were stealing little bits of it, and they had actually sold 3,000 yards of it nearby in Timminsville, making over $100 on this. And they were caught with about 1,000 yards of the cloth left.
Is a bleachery, does it just make like white cloth?
I think so. I think that's where they are like preparing the cloth and probably dyeing it. And yeah. And again, I couldn't find any follow-up for any sort of punishment. So I don't know if he's just served some time in jail and paid a fine or what happened here. A couple months before Earl's 4th birthday, in May 1939, David committed another crime back at the newly built Pond Hollow School. He and 2 other men actually broke into the school at night and stole a large quantity of canned food and silverware. Authorities easily tracked David down because he left behind his fingerprints in the break-in. When authorities revealed that evidence, the 3 men pled guilty to the theft. Again, I don't know what his punishment was for it. But David left town and moved to New York City, where he lived on 42nd Street, and I know this through his first draft registration card from October 1940. In 1941, David stole a car in Darlington, South Carolina, and drove it across state lines to Monroe, North Carolina. He was held in the Monroe jail awaiting federal court because he drove the stolen vehicle across state lines. And again, I couldn't find any details if he served time in a federal institution for this. So it's all these things that are just racking up. He registered for the draft in 1942, where his description noted he was 5'9", 146 pounds, had a dark complexion with brown hair and eyes, and had a, quote, large, deep scar at left cheek, end quote. In 1943, David was living in Hartsville, South Carolina, and returned to the textile industry at the Hartsville Print and Dye Works plant. And on January 17th, he spent the day drinking with a friend. This man later reported that they drank 4 or 5 quarts of beer each before David told his friend he was going to borrow a car and go visit his father. David was boarding at the home of Hiram Linton. It was after midnight, and he asked Mrs. Linton if he could borrow the family vehicle. She refused because he was drunk, but offered to drive. David demanded the keys, and when she refused, he turned violent. He struck Miss Linton on the face, busting open her nose. He knocked her out of the vehicle. Her daughter heard the commotion and yelled for David to stop. Later, she testified, quote,
I am the daughter of Hiram Linton. My age is 14. Well, I was in the yard. David Boan was out there at the car trying to get Mama to let him drive it. She did not want him to because he would tear it up. David began beating Mama with his fists. He knocked her down once. I ran around there begging him to quit.
So after beating Mrs. Linton, David got out of the car and walked to the woodpile where he picked up an axe and swung it at the vehicle twice, leaving large dents above the passenger side door. He turned toward the teenage girl and started after her. Quote,
He picked up the axe and ran after me. He was very close when the shot was fired. Maureen made no threat against David. David hit Mama once with his fist. I was running. I do not know whether or not Maureen gave David a warning or not. I do not know how long he has been staying in our home. David did not have any words or did not fight anyone else.
When Mrs. Linton's 17-year-old son heard the commotion, he actually had grabbed his shotgun and fired a single shot into David Boan's back as David chased the girl with an axe. David died instantly. When police arrived, they documented evidence of the struggle along with several quart and 12-ounce beer bottles scattered throughout the yard. Maureen was taken into custody and lodged in the Chesterfield jail to await court proceedings. He was released 2 days later. And again, I could not find any newspaper reference to a trial and can only assume authorities determined the shooting was an act of self-defense. 5 months later, on July 13, 1943, Maureen filled out his draft registration card and listed his mother's address as his own, suggesting he returned home and resumed his normal life. Now, I share this story because Earl was 7.5 years old when he lost his absentee father. He also seemed to deal with similar issues with drugs and alcohol and violence throughout his life. While his father is in and out of trouble, Earl had an unsteady childhood, moving between several households, being housed by his single mother who had her own difficulties struggling with health issues. At 5 years old, Earl appeared in the 1940 census, living with his grandparents, Emma and Stonewall Jackson Griggs, who went by Jack and Emma. They managed a farm in Antioch, South Carolina.
I love when people name their kids after big generals. So you've got just like a random Stonewall Jackson who really has no relation, but they were just like, their parents were fan girls of Stonewall, you know, like I love that. That's
I know.
So good.
I was like, I have to include that. It's just, yeah.
You must. But they called him Jack. That makes sense.
Yeah, Jack and Emma, yeah. So in the mid-1940s, Earl moved from his grandparents to live with his aunt. And she took care of him until he started to get into trouble near the late 1940s when he was sent to the Jackson Training School. He told authorities that he was in trouble a lot as a youth for stealing and associating with bad company. Due to his age, not much of this was published in newspapers at the time. He spent most of his young life in reform schools. He committed his first serious crime at 16 years old in March 1952. And again, I want to warn listeners now that this does include sexual assault of a minor. Earl was arrested on a charge of the rape of a 5-year-old girl. He was held under a $2,500 bond. Upon investigation after awaiting trial, the charge was reduced to assault with intent to commit rape. His bond was reduced to $2,000, and it came out that the girl had been, quote, assaulted but not criminally attacked, end quote. The newspaper noted that the judge sentenced him, quote, to from 22 to 24 months at a first offenders prison camp after the court had allowed a charge of assault on a female with the intent to commit rape to be changed to assault on a female inflicting serious injury, end quote. So Earl entered the North Carolina Central Prison in Raleigh on November 21st, 1952. Now, North Carolina had several prison work camps for youthful offenders that he likely served most, if not all of his time at. Plans for the prison began during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War in the late 1860s. The prison opened on January 6, 1870, with the creation of a small temporary building to house North Carolina's prisoners. Prior to this, towns and counties had to manage prisoners. This was when Idaho's territorial prison was still under construction. Construction on the first permanent building was completed in 1884 through prison labor, as well as the guidance of stone carver W.O. Wolfe, the father of legendary novelist Thomas Wolfe. In the 1940s, a state license plate fabrication and print shop opened, just like the old Idaho Penitentiary. Earl may have worked at the tag plant during his incarceration. Nowadays, the prison holds male prisoners ages 22 and older with sentences longer than 20 years. Have either of you seen Roof Man?
No.
No.
It's the story of Jeffrey Manchester. He escaped from prison and lived in a Toys R Us. And
I've heard about this.
And started a life
I have
as
never.
Johnson. Oh my gosh. He's actually currently incarcerated at the Central Prison in Raleigh. So this historic prison that's still active today. Definitely check out Roof Man. I had such a fun time watching that. So Earl was released from the North Carolina State Prison and returned to Thomasville. On July 18, 1954, he traveled to Whiting, Indiana. He had no place to stay. Whiting is on the northwest tip of Indiana near Chicago, right on Lake Michigan. And an old hometown friend, Clarence Hacker, felt sorry for Earl and took him in. Earl didn't stay long. He left the next day pocketing a woman's wristwatch belonging to his friend. Clarence reported the theft, and that afternoon, Earl was spotted at a nearby restaurant and arrested. The newspaper noted that besides the watch, Earl was also guilty of evading draft laws. He was fined $513 and sentenced to 6 months on the penal farm. Quote, unable to produce cash to pay the fine and costs, Boan may have to serve it out at $1 a day in addition to the 6 months, end quote. So if the penal farm sounds familiar, it's like what was happening here in Idaho. The penitentiary owned and operated the Mosley Ranch across Warm Springs Avenue, where the Warm Springs Golf Course now resides, as well as the Eagle Island Prison Farm. Indiana had a similar philosophy on a self-sustained prison system where prisoners raised and prepared all their own food. At 19 years old, Earl had spent the better part of his teenage years in training and reform schools and penitentiary work camps. In 1956, Earl traveled to Kellogg, Idaho. In May, he called for a taxi to drive him to Saltese, Montana, about half an hour east. His driver, Mrs. Winfred Stanton from Milan, picked him up, and as they neared the small, unincorporated town of Saltese, Earl changed his mind, saying, quote, Saltese is too small, end quote, and told Mrs. Stanton to keep driving onward to Missoula, another hour and a half away. As they came down US 10, about 8 miles from Missoula, Earl suddenly began assaulting Mrs. Stanton. She was able to reach her gun and held it on Earl as she drove on to Missoula. There, she contacted sheriff's deputies who arrested Earl. He had 55 cents on him when the police put him under arrest, not enough to pay the fare. On May 11th, Earl was charged with second-degree assault. He pled insanity and agreed to sign a voluntary commitment to Montana State Hospital. The next day, he was taken to State Hospital at Warm Springs. Earl arrived at the Montana State Hospital at a time when it hosted nearly 2,000 residents, a historic high. And I couldn't find any details about his stay in the hospital or his eventual release. According to Earl, he headed south to Oklahoma, where he was arrested for vagrancy. He later told authorities that, quote, he always had the feeling he hated to be confined to anywhere, end quote, and while in jail, slashed his wrists. Authorities took him to the Norman State Mental Hospital. Quote, Boan said he likes it in the mental hospital because he was in the open and not hemmed in by four walls, end quote. It wasn't long until Earl was in trouble at the hospital. Quote, one day at the hospital during a dance, he said he was reprimanded by the matron for dancing too closely with a girl and was confined in his room as punishment. Because of his hatred of confinement, he said he made his escape, end quote. He escaped from the hospital in early November and headed west, likely hitchhiking along the way. On Tuesday, November 27th, Earl arrived in Burley, Idaho. He used what money he had to buy a switchblade knife in town for $1.25 at the Wolf Hardware. Earl stopped into the Hitchin Post bar and spoke to the owner and operator, Ray Bigelow. He asked Ray if he knew of any work in Burley. Earl told Ray that he came up from Texas and was broke and hungry. Ray gave Earl $2 to get something to eat and to get a room for the evening. He introduced Earl to Mrs. Violet Thayer, a hostess at the Hitchin Post. She described Earl as a slight, pleasant, soft-spoken young man, and she in turn introduced Earl to Pearl Ertz, who managed the Pine Hotel above the Hitchin Post. The hotel had 16 mostly furnished rooms that offered $1 to $2 nightly rates, which is about $12 to $25 a night today. Pearl took Earl in and offered him a room just that evening, Tuesday, November 27th. He signed in under his name and listed his home as Thomasville, North Carolina. Pearl fed him dinner, likely hearing about Earl's struggles and desperation for a friend and a helping hand. Pearl Ertz, born Eliza Pearl Stafford, was born on June 6, 1903 in Stillville, Missouri. She married her first husband, Charlie Hatcher, in 1916 at the age of 13. He was 23 years old. They were living in Falls City, Nebraska in the 1920s. Now, her first husband died in Twin Falls in 1953. At some point, they separated. In 1945, she married Benjamin Ertz in Twin Falls. Ben had served time in the Deer Lodge, Montana Penitentiary in 1922 for grand larceny after stealing a horse. Pearl divorced Benjamin and moved in with a man named Joe Vigil, who later described himself as her common-law husband. Joe had a history of drunkenness, public intoxication, and drunk driving, and was locked up repeatedly in the Twin Falls County Jail in the 1940s and 1950s. In 1952, he was actually crossing the Rock Creek Bridge near South Park in Twin Falls, and an officer actually witnessed him heading to the retaining wall on the right side of the bridge. He corrected himself and nearly ran into that police officer. So obviously he was stopped and he was given a blood alcohol test, but before the results got back, admitted he was intoxicated and he had his license revoked for a year. In March 1956, Pearl moved to Burley and began leasing the Pine Hotel. Newspaper accounts depicted Joe as an ex-husband, and Joe described himself as Pearl's common-law husband. Regardless, she let him live at the Pine Hotel with her. I tell you all this to show you that she had a history of taking in individuals with troubled backgrounds and addictions. A petite woman, 53 years old, and around 5 feet, 2 inches tall, and 130 pounds, she took care of people and was, quote, known for a habit of befriending persons down on their luck, end quote. During the early hours on Thursday, November 29, 1956, Earl went drinking with a soldier. At around 4:30 a.m., he had coffee at Nelson's Cafe. Mr. and Mrs. Thayer happened to return home from a trip from Salt Lake City and saw Earl at the cafe. So they sat down with him, and the three had coffee and returned to the Pine Hotel. Earl finally went to bed. Around 1 p.m., he woke up and went to the hotel's communal kitchen a few doors from his room. Pearl made him a late breakfast, and Mrs. Thayer approached Earl and told him to go to the bowling alley in town to see if they had any jobs available. Earl said he couldn't because he had a really bad blister on his heel. After breakfast, Pearl took him to a nearby drugstore and bought him some bandages and medicine for the sore heel. They returned to the Pine Hotel at around 2:50 p.m. Miss Thayer saw them return, and Pearl told Miss Thayer that she was actually heading to Twin Falls later that afternoon, where she had put down a deposit on a house. She and Joe were going to leave Burley and move back to Twin Falls on Saturday because it was closer to Joe's work. After breakfast, Earl returned to his room, likely to sleep off a hangover, I'm guessing. Between 3 and 4 p.m., while everyone but Earl was out of the hotel at work, Pearl began tidying up rooms. Earl left his room and went to the upstairs entrance to the hotel and locked the door. He found Pearl sweeping up her room, walking in with her back turned to him. He charged towards her and attempted to sexually assault her. She resisted and screamed, and Earl panicked. He He pulled his switchblade and committed what authorities called, quote, a sudden frenzy, end quote. He stabbed her 7 times in the back. A bartender downstairs who was taking a phone call heard the commotion and scream, but thought a fight must be going on, a not all too uncommon occurrence at the Pine Hotel. Pearl reached behind her to grab the knife, resulting in knife wounds on both of her thumbs. She fell to the floor, turning over to face her assailant. Earl pinned her and grabbed her throat while he stabbed her several more times. The coroner, Dr. Creed, stated that, quote, the grip across her throat was so firm it broke the bone in the throat that protects the windpipe, end quote. The deepest wound was on the right side of her chest. In all, Earl stabbed Pearl 12 times in the back, 3 times front of the chest, and once on the upper left thigh. 7 of the wounds punctured her lungs, ultimately resulting in her death.
Oh, jeez.
So Earl washed his hands in the restroom, took clothes from another boarder, including a leather jacket, balled up his bloody clothing, and stuck it back in his room. He left the hotel through the back stairs and out into an alleyway on 13th Street where he stopped in at Hat's TV and Antenna store. He asked the clerk to call a taxicab for him. He walked up to the street to the Wydell intersection and flung the switchblade knife, and he took a taxi to the outskirts of town, having no money, got out. He stepped into Jones Cafe, then raised his thumb to hitch a ride. A driver picked him up and began driving to Utah. His first stop was in Bountiful, Utah, then Salt Lake City. There, he stopped in a restaurant and befriended a man who lent him money and even let Earl stay overnight with him. Back at Burley at 7:10 p.m. that evening, Mr. and Mrs. Thayer returned to the hotel. They found the front entrance locked with the deadbolt, something that they'd never had a problem with. They knocked and yelled at the door and nobody answered. Joe Vigil and Fred Fulenfant returned to the hotel and tried to use a key to the door, but it didn't work. Another resident, Ernest Hopkins, went around to the back stairs and finally found the unlocked door. He unlocked the deadbolt and let the other residents in. Violet Thayer went around looking for Pearl. She came to room number 9, which was slightly ajar with a light on. She tried to push it open, but something inside was blocking the door. Joe Vigil gave it a shove, opening up to the murder scene. Pearl's body was lying in a pool of blood with a broom and dustpan nearby. Mrs. Thayer ran downstairs and phoned the police. Joe said most of Pearl's clothing had been torn from her body. He also stated that Pearl usually pinned cash inside her dress, estimated between $900 to $1,100 from the summer that was missing. Police began the investigation, and all the rumors at the Pine Hotel were accounted for except Earl Boan. Several folks in the city told authorities that Pearl was last seen with Earl as she bought bandages for his heel. Authorities searched his room and found the blood-stained clothing. They found a blood-soaked handkerchief containing $320 under Pearl's body, adding mystery to the motivation for this murder. They set up roadblocks at Buell and Strevel after a truck driver reported he saw a man matching Earl's description thumbing for a ride east of Burley on US 30 South. Authorities brought a bloodhound named Queenie to the scene. The dog led officers to the Burley rail yard, a path they later learned Earl took earlier in the week while searching for a job. A man matching Earl's description was arrested in Boise and held for questioning. He matched Earl's description in every way except his height, 6 feet 4 inches tall. Earl was only about 5'11". They had the wrong man. The next morning, Earl was in Salt Lake City, Utah. He hailed for a taxi who picked him up around 7 a.m. and drove him out near the airport. He didn't have enough to pay the $1.25 fare, but the taxi driver didn't bother. The driver told a friend about the ride and was told about the murder in Burley. The driver contacted authorities and recalled the, quote, suspicious and nervous youth, end quote, that he had given a ride to. Earl hitchhiked to Mills Junction. From there, he hitched a ride to Grantsville, 3 hours south of Burley, on the southern tip of the Great Salt Lake. Around 10:15 a.m., officers in Grantsville spotted Earl as he stood outside of a cafe on the highway thumbing a ride west to Nevada. State Trooper Howard Cooper and Patrolman Neil Bishop picked him up. Earl remained calm and told the police his name was Jackson. After some questioning, he finally admitted that he was Earl Boan and an escapee from the Norman, Oklahoma mental institution and had served time in Montana for assault. He had no money, removing the claim that the murder was intended to rob Pearl of the nearly $1,000 clipped to her dress. Earl spoke freely with the officers about the killing, but could only recall stabbing her the one time and stated that he blanked out after that and only remembered changing his clothes and getting out of town. He waived extradition proceedings by noon, and Idaho authorities started heading to the Tooele County Jail to bring him back for trial. Utah authorities used a tape recorder to capture Earl's confession. He was recorded saying, quote, "I don't know why I did it. I just stabbed her. I don't know whether I throttled her or not," end quote. He told authorities he was planning to head west to California and ultimately to Mexico to escape. Services for Pearl Eretz were held on Tuesday, December 4th at the Joseph Payne Memorial Chapel, officiated by Reverend Kenneth Beal of the Presbyterian Church. She was buried at the Pleasant View Cemetery. And the funeral actually reunited two of her brothers who had not seen each other for 39 years, and the only family who could make the trip for her funeral. Pearl left behind five brothers and four sisters.
That's so tragic.
Yeah. Oh, and members of the local Masonic Lodge actually came and served as pallbearers. Like this was a huge story and a huge impact to this community.
Burley's a small town.
Yeah.
It would be shocking to have something like this happen anywhere, but with a town where everyone would have known her.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's known as this sweetheart lady that takes in these folks. You know, this is a cheap hotel. Like it was not uncommon for her to, prevent somebody from getting a vagrancy charge by giving them a room for the night, just like taking care of them, getting them back on their feet, giving them a shower, like
buying them bandages.
Right. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Well, and that is such a brutal personal thing. 12 stab wounds is not like, oh, I got caught. I don't know, whatever some excuse would be. It is so vicious and violent. 12 stab wounds.
Yeah.
And from her perspective, like, that's so scary. Mm-hmm. She takes a man into her house trying to help him with, like, no idea how much, like, anger and just who she's let into her home, into her hotel.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking for anybody with those kind hearts. Like,
be careful.
Yeah, be careful. And, oh, man, keep those hearts open. But, yeah, this just as somebody who would help anybody, like, gosh, that's so scary to think about. So the day after the murder, Earl was in the Burley jail, charged with first-degree murder. On Monday, December 3rd, Earl was arraigned and charged with murder in the first degree. He signed a statement admitting to the murder but didn't provide a motive, and when he stood before the judge, he declined to enter a plea. The following week, on December 11th, 5 witnesses took the stand during the preliminary, including Joe Vigil, Miss Thayer, Coroner Garth Payne, Twin Falls pathologist Dr. J. Woodson Creed, and Sheriff LePage Layton. They all recounted the details that I used earlier while describing the commission of the crime. Dean Kopfler, his appointed attorney, claimed that the testimony at the preliminary trial was not sufficient to establish a motive or show premeditation. Prosecuting attorney Norman Nielsen disagreed and explained that Earl's return from the drugstore with Pearl, locking the lobby door, changing his clothes, and collecting his switchblade knife was premeditation. The judge agreed and held Earl in jail without bail. On Tuesday, Police Chief George Worrell took to the stand and recounted the admissions Earl made to the police in Tooele, Utah. In the courtroom, Earl sat quietly with manacled hands, his hair slicked back, occasionally looking around at the handful of people sitting in the courtroom. On December 17th, Earl asked for psychiatric treatment at a mental institution. His lawyer requested that Earl be sent to State Hospital South in Blackfoot. Prosecutor Nielsen said sending Earl to Blackfoot would, quote, leave the impression that the defendant is mentally ill, end quote. He called to have local physicians to determine Earl's mental condition. Regardless, Earl was taken to Blackfoot on January 5th, 1957 for examination. He was returned to Burley for arraignment on January 15th. There, he pled not guilty. His trial was set for February 4th. A sanity hearing was held, and the 12-man jury heard the testimony of psychiatrists, psychologists, and the police officers. Dr. E.G. Ward, psychiatrist at State Hospital South, stated, quote, I think the diagnosis most fitting to Boan is that he has a personality trait disturbance, both passive and aggressive, and I don't believe he should be released upon society, end quote. Dr. Castor, chief clinical psychologist, said Earl was a, quote, dangerous person, end quote, and he doubted Earl's condition could be corrected. He also noted that Earl, quote, had the verbal intelligence of a 13-year-old. His performance intelligence, however, was that of a 9-year-old. Furthermore, his emotional responses were that of a 2 to 9-year-old child. Boan's verbal intelligence would place him at the top of a lower strata of society in which 32% of the country's population is included. Persons in this category, however, are able to marry and live relatively normal lives. Unusual aspects of Boan's situation was the inverse relation of his performance intelligence, which, unlike most everyone else's, was lower than his verbal intelligence, end quote. Of course, this is all documented in the newspaper. A neuropsychiatrist from Ogden, Utah, said Earl acted without thinking, was impulsive, hot-tempered, and, quote, did not appreciate the valuable things of life, end quote. It took an hour and 20 minutes for the jury to return the verdict that Earl Boan was sane enough to stand trial. Earl was brought in wearing a yellow sports shirt, blue pants, and tattered stringless shoes. Burley police asked for permission to keep Earl handcuffed during the trial, but the judge denied the request. Armed police and sheriff's deputies kept watch in the wings throughout the trial. Jury selection began on February 7th, and it took the whole day to question 39 prospective jurors. The jury consisted of 10 men and 2 women, with another male alternate. During jury selection, the prosecutor asked the jurors if they were opposed to capital punishment, hinting that he was likely going to ask for the death penalty. Earl's lawyer asked about their attitude towards insanity as a defense. Prosecutor Nielsen drew on Earl's testimony that showed he was aware and able to recall all of the places he had traveled in 1956, traveling all throughout the United States. On Friday, Earl came in wearing a tan gabardine suit and polished shoes that his mother sent to him from Thomasville, North Carolina. A picture of Earl's body was introduced as evidence in the trial, despite objections from the defense, who described the photo as horror and, quote, an attempt to prejudice the jury, end quote. Witnesses took to the stand, starting with Hitchin Post manager Ray Bigelow, then Mrs. Thayer, and finally Pearl's ex, Joe Vigil, who testified all the details I shared above. Gail Wolfe, who ran the Wolfe hardware store, testified to selling Earl the switchblade and whetstone to sharpen blades a day before the murder. Police Chief George Worrell, Coroner Garth Payne, and Sheriff LePage Layton and Fred Folenfant took the stand next. During the trial, Earl's attitude fluctuated from appearing bored, yawning loudly during some proceedings, to looking around the courtroom and, quote, leering and sneering at persons who caught his eye, end quote. At one point, the prosecution brought in a mannequin wearing Earl's bloody clothing, which elicited some emotion from Earl. The defense objected to the mannequin, saying it was not part of the evidence. Prosecution explained that they wanted to show where the knife wounds were thrust on the body. The judge ruled in favor of the defense, and the mannequin was removed. On Saturday, February 9, 1957, the jury deliberated for 4.5 hours before returning the guilty verdict for murder in the first degree. They recommended life imprisonment. While this trial was going on, Burley police realized that they needed to recruit junior police to help with regular functions because Earl's case required them to act as premise guards, searchers, and detectives. They hired and trained 6 community teenagers to act as fill-ins for the next time a large case hit the community. They didn't have power to make arrests, but they could help with minor functions of police and aid in emergency responses. Just something that I thought was really interesting for a small town, to think about, we need to start getting some teenagers and like the next generation and get the community involved because we are all on deck right now and cannot handle the day-to-day. On February 15th, District Judge R.W. Beckwith sentenced Earl Boan to life in prison. Earl, with his hands handcuffed to a belt around his waist, displayed no emotion to the pronouncement and refused to answer when the judge asked if there was any reason the sentence should not be passed. 5 attended the sentencing, including 2 journalists, 2 jurors who convicted him, and a minister who had been attending to him. He was immediately taken to Boise to serve out his sentence in the Idaho State Penitentiary. So his intake: Earl Boan, number 9599, crime, murder in the first degree, sentence, natural life, received February 15, 1957 from Cassia County, pled not guilty, born in Chesterfield, South Carolina, July 31st, 1935. His father was deceased. His mother, Ethel Boan, nee Jordan, was still alive. He was single. He had German-English descent, Protestant, non-denominational upbringing. Brown eyes, brown hair, 5 foot, 11 inches tall, 171 pounds, with a medium complexion. He was tall. He had no deformities. He was circumcised and vaccinated. He had 6 tattoos. He drank, smoked, and said he did use drugs, including morphine, codeine, yellow jack, barbitol, and, quote, there may be others, end quote. He was raised Protestant. He didn't gamble. He quit school in the 8th grade. His occupation was common laborer and a transient. He was single and had no military service. And his Bertillon was very insightful. It noted his teeth were bad. He had a mole on the right side of his neck. He had 13 parallel scars from razor cuts on his right arm and 8 on his left arm. Underneath the self-inflicted scars on his inner left arm was a cross tattoo. He had scars on his knees and shins and a note that stated, quote, both legs crooked, giving appearance of being bow-legged, end quote. He had a cross tattoo on the back of his left bicep, a heart and scroll on the left arm next to the word love on a heart pierced by an arrow, and he had true tattooed across his right fist, a cross and heart on the back of his right bicep, Mom written on a heart on the back of his right bicep, and EB, his initials, on the left side of his right forearm. He also had 14 self-inflicted scars on the outside of his left forearm and 10 on the outside of his right forearm. So he comes in just covered in self-inflicted scars, wounds, and tattoos. His statement about the crime, he wrote, quote, on November 29, 1956, at a hotel in Burley, Idaho, the woman who operated the hotel was cleaning up one of the rooms. I entered the room she was cleaning. After entering the room, I took a knife out of my pocket and opened the blade. I told her to lie down, that I was going to have intercourse with her. She got scared and told me to get out of the room and started yelling for the police. I got panicky, then I stabbed her. I remember stabbing her twice, but I do not recall how many more times I stabbed her. According to the report, she was stabbed a good many times. After stabbing her, I left the hotel and hitchhiked my way to Utah. I was arrested in Tooele, Utah on November 30th, 1956. I waived extradition to Idaho and arrived back in Burley on November 30th. On the intake card, the prosecuting attorney recounted the crime and included a note from the psychiatrist stating, quote, the psychiatrist testifying at the trial stated that Earl David Boan was a very dangerous individual and upon the proper provocation would kill again. If he is restricted in what he believes he should do, he becomes angry and tries to injure the individual restricting him. The psychiatrist believed that Boan would continue to be a killer if let out into society, and my recommendation would be that Earl David Boan be confined in the penitentiary for the rest of his natural life and that he never be given the opportunity for a parole from that institution, end quote. It was noted that Earl liked watching and playing all the major sports and would like to play softball and baseball if offered the opportunity. He liked to fish and play cards. So Earl was processed in the 1890 cell house, where he would spend much of his sentence. By February 19, 1957, he had been transferred to a segregated unit in 2 house. You know, at this time, 4 house and 5 house are constructed, and 2 house is usually used for segregation. Most prisoners were in 3 house or 4 house if they weren't being punished or anything. Now, the following month, journalist Seymour Ettman published a story in True Crime magazine titled Switchblade for the Good Samaritan, documenting Earl's murder case. If any listener actually has a copy of the March 1957 edition of True Crime magazine, I would love to read it, so let me know. Prison records actually paint a troubling picture of Earl's mental state. One report noted, quote, since December 19, 1957, this man has demonstrated continued homicidal and suicidal tendencies. He has been isolated during much of this period, end quote. On February 19, 1958, Earl asked to be locked up because he was, quote, afraid he was going to kill someone, end quote. 3 days later, he was taken to the prison hospital after cutting his left wrist with a piece of mirror. I'm not sure if this was the point, but other prisoners in the cooler witnessed Earl cutting himself. In this audio clip with prisoners Clark, Carringer, and Dobson from February 22, 1979, they talk about Earl cutting himself in Siberia severely.
Well, it was. One guy cut his wrist over there, Earl Boan, and he actually had blood every time his heart beat. The blood just spurted out his arm. He's got laying outside the bars. I'm laying in my cell there. I can see the whole thing. And we yelled, I guess, for about 30 minutes till everybody just give out. This guy's about to bleed to death. Pretty quick, here come one of them and looked in finally. But he liked to die.
How did he cut his arm?
Oh, I don't remember now what he used. I think a little piece of metal they sharpened up like a razor blade.
So it was self-inflicted?
That happened in the hole is where that happened. He was selling what's it two backwards, 4 and 6?
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4.
3 and 4. Well, he's selling sell 3 there, and I was selling and sell 4. Turning back, you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to understand whether or not was he trying to commit suicide, or was this an accident, or what?
He wanted sympathy.
Oh, so he just wanted some attention more than...
That's about what amounted to.
I see.
It was self-inflicted.
Brutal oral history there. On March 3rd, 1958, while housed in Five House, Earl tore apart his clothes, blankets, and mattress and threw them into the walkway. He smashed his toilet and used the broken porcelain to shatter several windows throughout maximum security. Staff responded by placing him in solitary confinement in the hole, likely referring to what we now know as the cooler. Just under 2 months later, on May 21st, he was released from the hole and returned to segregation in Two House. His struggles continued. On June 23, 1958, Earl attempted suicide by cutting himself 26 times, 13 wounds on each arm. Prison nurses closed the injuries with 57 stitches. Just over a week later, on July 2nd, Earl set fire to his mattress and cut his arm with a tin can. Once again, he was returned to the hole. On September 15th, he requested transfer from the cooler to Siberia because, as prison records noted, quote, he wished to be where it was quiet. The talking of the other fellows was bugging him, end quote. 5 days later, however, he was moved back to segregation in Two House. At some point during 1959, Earl was again confined to the hole before returning to Two House on May 18th. Less than 2 months later, on July 7th, he requested another transfer to Siberia, where he remained until September 8th. Although I couldn't find the exact dates he was released from segregation, his next disciplinary record in 1961 shows he had been returned to the 1890 cell house, One House, to continue serving his punishment. Here, guard Chet Stinnett, in his May 1992 oral history, talks about segregation in One House and Earl Boan.
I worked, One House was the first cell house that I worked in. That's where they kept all of the deviants at, and some of the real bad actors were down on the first tier, A tier. That's where they had a mutilation murderer named Earl Boan.
In April 1960, Earl appeared before the pardon board, but his request for release was denied. On October 25th, 1960, he was once again transferred to Siberia. 11 days later, on November 5th, he was moved back to the cooler to continue his punishment. On June 15th, 1961, Earl was sent back to the hole from his cell in One House. Things finally seemed to improve in early 1962. On February 26th, Earl was released from segregation in the 1890 cell house and assigned to work in the prison tailor shop, located in the building that now houses the J. Curtis Earl Memorial Exhibit. Later, he became the janitor for Four House. On August 21st, 1962, Earl was assigned to the sign shop and license plate factory in Two Yard. The job lasted only 4 days before he returned to his duties as the Four House janitor. For the first time in years, it appeared Earl was beginning to settle into prison life. Warden Clapp's notes from August 6, 1962 reflect that change. He wrote that Earl was adjusting well, working steadily, and had recently been visited by his mother from North Carolina. Earl had also expressed a desire to obtain a paying job in prison. He appeared before the pardon board again on January 2, 1963, but was denied. 4 days later, prison officials assigned him to the grounds maintenance in the main yard, and it proved to be a miserable time to start outdoor work. Boise endured an especially harsh winter, with temperatures dropping to 7 degrees below zero on January 12th and nearly 9 inches of snow accumulated by the end of the month. Earl likely spent his days shoveling snow and performing these outdoor maintenance projects. By February 22nd, he had reached his breaking point and refused to work. He was sent back to the segregation unit in Two House. After the winter finally gave way to spring, Earl returned to work on May 13th, 1963, this time in the license plate factory in Two Yard. In Warden Clapp's August 1963 report, Earl requested a transfer either to a federal prison or to a state hospital south. Clapp wrote that Earl, quote, believes he hears inmates talking about him in the distance, which causes him to become nervous and under a tension, which he can't get rid of. He's taking tranquilizers, but they do not do him much good, end quote. On September 11th, Earl was assigned a new job as the yard janitor in 2 Yard, likely maintaining the school and vocational buildings and the surrounding grounds, outlaw field, everything else. By the end of that month, he snapped. Earl celled in 2 House with other men in for segregation, including 36-year-old veteran named Ernesto Blanco, serving a 20-year sentence for lewd and lascivious conduct on a minor and second-degree kidnapping. Now, we've discussed Ernesto previously on a Stool Pigeon Saturday with Saeed Boan. Ernesto was arrested after taking a 5-year-old girl on a joyride in 1961 during a drinking binge and returning her to her grandmother's home 13 hours later. Little girl's father began driving her to the hospital when she spotted Ernesto's vehicle. The father ran Ernesto off the road and held him up with an unloaded pistol until authorities arrived. While facing trial, Ernesto was taken to Blackfoot for a psychiatric evaluation, and he escaped. He was caught in Texas and brought back to Idaho for trial, where he was sentenced to prison. While incarcerated, he was a model prisoner and regularly donated blood and did his work. Due to his crime, 2 House was likely a safe space to segregate him from the rest of the prison population. Danger came on September 26, 1963, at 4:23 p.m. Ernesto and several prisoners were standing at the base of the stairs between 2 and 3 House, waiting to return to their cells. Earl approached from the top of the stairs, and according to accounts from a man who witnessed the attack, Chris Zavala, Earl walked down the steps with a hand behind his back and a finger over his lips, alerting everyone to be quiet. He came up behind Ernesto and began stabbing him with a homemade 7-inch blade. After the attack, Earl fled and hid the knife in a crack in a bench in the prison theater. Ernesto was pronounced dead at 5:15 p.m. When asked why he did it, Earl said, quote, I just didn't like the man, end quote. Other accounts noted that Ernesto, quote, bugged him, end quote. Earl at first denied the incident and later admitted it and signed a confession. Ernesto's family was contacted but could not take the remains, so he is buried in the prison cemetery, and he had served both in World War II and Korea and is one of 2 men in the prison cemetery with military markers. Earl was transferred back to the 1890 cell house during the investigation into Ernesto's murder. On October 3rd, he was moved to a segregation cell in 2 House, only to be returned to the 1890 cell house 2 days later. He appeared in court on October 7, 1963, where he was formally charged with the murder. Rather than entering a plea, Earl requested a psychiatric evaluation. On October 29th, he was placed in solitary confinement, and he remained there until November 11th, when he returned to the 1890 cell house to undergo his psychiatric examination the following day. When Earl returned to court on November 26th, he wanted to plead guilty. His court-appointed attorney, Blaine Evans, actually refused to allow it and insisted that he enter a plea of not guilty. The trial was scheduled for January 20th, 1964. Less than 2 weeks later, on December 7th, Earl was back in solitary confinement. 2 days later, Warden Clapp received a heartbreaking letter from Earl's mother. She wrote, quote, I am awful sorry the serious trouble that happened to Earl there in the prison. I wouldn't have had anything like that to have happened for anything in the world if I could have helped it. He surely upset Earl very bad. I haven't had a letter from Earl in a long time. Just the one he wrote, it sounds like he wrote it, and someone typed it for him, and he had signed signature to it at the bottom telling me about the awful tragedy. So, Mr. Clapp, please make believe this was your son, and he is not a well child either. I'm sure you would want to hear from him as much as I do, since he is my child. So please be as good to him as if he was your son as long as he is there at the prison in your care. Please allow us to write each other. Please, Mr. Clapp, when you answer my letter, tell me if we will be permitted to give Earl's gifts from the family for Christmas. I hope so. Yours truly, Miss Ethel Boan. Clapp's response was brief. Subject was given the letter you wrote to him, and he was instructed to write you, end quote. A month later, on January 8th, 1964, Earl returned to the 1890 cell house as his attorneys pursued a sanity hearing. When his trial date arrived on January 20th, the judge postponed the proceedings until April 13th, and Earl was returned to prison. A few days later, another letter arrived from his mother. She explained that she had not heard from Earl since January 20th, when he had written that he expected a sanity hearing. She asked Warden Clapp if Earl could give him permission to write. Clapp simply replied that no permission was necessary. Earl already had writing privileges. On March 3rd, Earl was again placed in solitary confinement. A week later, his mother wrote once more. This time, she had purchased him a small transistor radio, but had heard prison officials might remove the speaker. She closed her letter by writing, "He very lonely and lonesome while waiting. He seems to think the radio and the music will help him and entertain him also." Warden Clapp responded a week later, stating Earl was in solitary confinement, quote, "for attempting to cut his wrists with a light globe, burning his mattress and bedding. Therefore, he is not permitted the use of a radio. However, if you care to send the radio as it is, we will disconnect the speaker, and when he is again moved to his cell, he could then use the radio if he desires to do so." End quote. In this oral history taken by Rodger Hall on November 12, 1993, he talks about fixing up Earl after cutting himself with a light bulb on Sunday while Rodger was at church. He was instructed to not give Earl Novocaine.
Like with Earl Boan. I don't know how many times I sewed Earl Boan up, put stitches in.
He's the man that tried several times to commit suicide?
Yeah, he didn't really want to commit suicide. He just inflict injury upon himself and wanted attention. And, it was his way of getting at himself.
So you stitched him up?
Oh, yes. And I don't know. I can remember one time was the associate warden at that time. And Earl Boan had cut himself really bad. And I had to go over and get him. Matter of fact, he was in one house at that time, and he'd taken the inside of a light bulb and run it down inside inside of his arm here, big light bulb, and blood was just all over. It was on a Sunday, and I was in church, and they called me, and I went over there, and blood was just everywhere, and so we got him over to the hospital, and here comes. And he was mad, and so he told me to sew him up, and so I went to deaden his arm, and he said, "No Novocaine." And so I sewed him up without any Novocaine.
Did the guy do it again after that?
Oh yeah. I don't know how many times, how many stitches. I bet I probably put in Earl Boan over 500 stitches on the time I was here in a year's time. He was always doing something. But,
by the spring of 1964, Earl had become consumed with representing himself. On April 20th, he wrote to the prison officials requesting law books and legal supplies so he could prepare a writ of habeas corpus. In one letter, he argued, "When I appeared on television, this enough to cause me to have a prejudiced trial. The warden is punishing me for the crime committed. This is double jeopardy." That same day, he wrote directly to Warden Clapp, "I have been suffering mental torture ever since I have been here. Will you please consider transferring me to a federal prison and let me pull the remainder of my time there? Here, I'll be able to rehabilitate myself and become a useful citizen. The guard in one house is persecuting me. Would you tell him to leave me alone? I don't hate you. I just want you to understand me and help me. I'm not allowed to play games with other inmates, and I'm pulling a hard time. I have no intention of wanting to kill again. I realize there isn't anything I can say to get you to change your mind about this. If you have any questions to ask me, I'll be glad to tell you the truth. Thank you." 9 days later, he sent another letter marked "Important Business," requesting Idaho law books, paper, pencils, envelopes, even a light bulb so he could actually continue preparing his legal filings. During this period, Earl continued moving between solitary confinement, Siberia, and the 1890 cell house while preparing for the trial. Finally, on April 13, 1964, Earl appeared before the judge and pled guilty to second-degree murder. He received a second life sentence. Warden Clapp later noted that Earl would have become eligible for parole on his first life sentence in 1967, but the second life sentence created a complicated legal question that would likely require an opinion from the Idaho Attorney General. Then, just a month later, Earl changes his mind. He withdraws his guilty plea, enters a plea of not guilty, and cited disagreements with his court-appointed attorney. The court scrambled to prepare for trial once again. Only a month later, on June 8, 1964, Earl reversed course yet again and pleads guilty for a second time. So, in a sense, Earl had now sentenced himself to life imprisonment 3 separate times. That August, his attorneys petitioned the State Board of Examiners, asking that Earl either receive psychiatric treatment within Idaho's penitentiary or be transferred to a federal institution. The State Board of Examiners reviewed the case and said due to Earl's young age, 29 years old, and the anticipation that he would never be rehabilitated enough to return to society, it would cost about $10 a day for treatment for him, and if treatment was to his natural death, it would cost taxpayers $100,000 through his life in prison. They shared the opinion of a psychiatrist that Earl was, quote, essentially untreatable, end quote. They were asking for Earl to be sent to a federal facility in Missouri for treatment, noting that Idaho's mental health facilities weren't secure enough to hold him. And the penitentiary wasn't proper for him either because he was being, quote, locked up like a dog because he is too dangerous to be placed with the other prisoners, end quote. Earl refused to give up. Preparing his own petitions, he argued that his constitutional rights had been violated by receiving 2 life sentences. He claimed he had been prejudiced by the publication of the True Detective magazine article before trial and insisted that when he killed Ernesto, quote, I did not know right from wrong, end quote, continuing by saying, quote, I would bang the back part of my head against the steel door and I injured my head because my ears popped. I've tried to kill myself 11 times since I've been here, end quote. Again, that True Detective actually came out after he was received at the prison. So not logical and not a lot of support and not, doing this by himself. And as we heard from the psychiatrist that he had, maybe a developmental disability or, had not quite fully developed. In April 1965, the judge said there was no evidence that Earl's constitutional rights were violated and he had adequate representation at both trials. The judge also commented on how it was obvious that Earl actually prepared the petition himself without legal counsel. His request to be sent to a federal institution was denied. Earl returned to the 1890 cell house where he remained until October when he was transferred back to 2 House. Over the next 2 years, Earl continued cycling between the 1890 cell house, 2 House, 5 House, Siberia, and the cooler. Warden Clapp's reports reveal a man desperately seeking treatment while repeatedly filing legal petitions and requesting transfers. He asked to watch television, play baseball, learn a trade, receive a special diet, obtain psychiatric care, undergo shock treatments, and eventually be transferred anywhere he might receive meaningful mental health treatment. On October 1st, 1965, he wrote a letter to Warden Clapp saying, from this day forth, I won't write the rest of the time I'm here or get any more knives. I won't write any more letters to you and more something asking both of doctors to transfer me to a mental hospital because I fully realize that both of you have tried and this is all you could do and I appreciate your help. Concerning the knife that Captain caught me with in 1 House, I changed my mind about killing him and broke it in half and threw it in a trash barrel. I did not get this knife in 2 yards, so from now on I'm going to behave myself, and if you ever decide to give me any more privileges, I'll behave myself. I fully realize that I've had to prove myself to you and Captain Howard, so please, don't hold a grudge against me. Respectfully yours, Earl Boan. On October 7th, District Court Judge Merlin S. Young denied Earl's writ. The statesman noted that Earl, quote, accused prison officials of using fear psychology. Earl also claimed that he had, quote, been in solitary confinement 27 straight months, was not allowed to write his mother, had been refused mental treatment, and was denied the use of Idaho code in preparing his petition, end quote. In the denial, Judge Young called out Warden Clapp and ordered him to allow Earl to access the 4 volumes of Idaho code. On October 20th, he was sent to the prison hospital to serve as a patient. And we have an oral history with Russ Anspaugh taken on April 6, 1982, talking about Earl getting beaten in the hospital for refusing to follow orders.
But when I was working in the hospital, there was a man named Boan. He was a mental case, and he'd done a lot of time. They'd had him on drugs for so long, he was just almost a zombie. And he used to slash himself all the time. And this one night, they brought him over from Siberia. I know he was in the hole. And he'd slashed himself both arms from the wrist clear up to the shoulder, just a bloody mess of slashes. I worked about 4 hours sewing the man up, and he'd lost a lot of blood, and he was pretty weak. So when I finished, I told the guards, I said, you better leave the man here for a few days until he can get his strength back. He's lost a lot of blood and so forth. They said, oh, we can't do anything without permission, so they called this Boan anyway. Well, they hated convicts in general. So here he come. And Boan was laying up on the little operating room table we had there, and he started to have a bowel movement when he was laying there. So I had him, his pants were about halfway between his thighs and his knees, and I had a bedpan under him, and he was almost unconscious at the time. So he came in, and he told Boan, he said, "Get off that table and go back over the hole." And Boan, it registered, but he couldn't hardly respond. He's kind of moaning and groaning a little. And Carringer started cussing him out. I told him, "You so-and-so." He said, "Get off that table." He said, "Or I'll break that arm off and beat you with it." And so Boan's trying to struggle off the table, and he got about halfway off, and Carringer grabbed him. And then when he hit the floor, his pants started to drop, so he has no balance whatsoever, and he's wobbling. And Carringer beat him unmercifully, beat him unconscious onto the floor, had the guards throw him back on the stretcher, told him, "I'll take him over there, maybe next time you do a better job." You know, that was the kind of mentality we had. I'm not saying all the guards are like that. It's probably a real outstanding exception to the rule. But that was a lot of the mentality we had back then. Luke Clapp was generally the same mentality. That's why he could throw a man in the hole and forget him for 2, 3, 4 years. He could care less.
Yeah. So after treatment, he returns to the 1890 cell house, and he wrote a letter that was very difficult to decipher, this very scratchy cursive that travels sideways up the page at one point on October 29th, requesting a good ballpoint pen, paper, and the Idaho code books. He continued by saying, quote, "I don't like the way you are letting Captain ruin this prison, so I'm going to file a writ against you and Captain Howard," end quote. He continued by saying that he knew of 2 doctors that, quote, "prove to you that I'm telling you the truth," and continues by saying, "Being agitated here, please put me back in 2 house. I don't get along with blank because all he talks about is sucking Peter and him getting I'm trying to live a blank life. If you will please put me back in 2 house, I will write my mass," which I think was his mother, but I couldn't tell. "The prison doctor is me around. I've got blank in my arm, and he wouldn't give me any medicine for it, for the infection. Dr. Beale gave me energy medicine to relax me. Body depressed for 8 years, I've had people constantly reading my mind, agitating me, persecuting me. This is driving me crazy. Please let me see Dr. Jewell in town today. He is a psychiatrist. I tell him the truth. Thank you, Earl Boan," end quote. On November 30th, he was sent back to solitary, likely Siberia. A couple days later, he requested to go to 5 House to write a legal document. There, he wrote a writ of habeas corpus. After he completed that, he returned to solitary the next day. On December 3rd, he was written up for a new offense after violating Rules 1, 2, and 6 when he, quote, "removed the cast from his arm while confined in solitary confinement number 1, end quote. On December 14th, after writing another difficult-to-decipher letter to Warden Clapp, he was returned to the writ room in 5 House. He also requested to be back to 2 House and promised to behave himself. The next day, he returned to solitary. On December 20th, he was taken back to the 1890 cell house segregation unit. In Warden Clapp's log about Earl on January 27, 1966, he noted that Earl was having trouble in the 1890 cell house because another prisoner was acting like a guard. Earl was requesting to move to 5 House where he could read. He also mentioned that Earl, quote, "said he had sex relations with 2 inmates while in the hospital, and they didn't even give him cigarettes," end quote. Earl requested shock treatment to cure his mental condition. At some point, he returned to solitary in 1966, but returned to the 1890 cell house on February 7, 1966. 2 days later, he returned to solitary. He remained there until March 9th, when he requested to write a legal document back in 5 House. The next day, he was sent back to the 1890 cell house. Warden Clapp reported on August 16, 1966, that Earl weighed 245 pounds and wanted to lose weight. He remained out of trouble until August 18th, when he returned to solitary confinement. On September 1st, he was taken back to the segregation unit in the 1890 cell house. In January 1967, Warden Clapp wrote that Earl gained 10 more pounds, weighing 255 pounds. He was sent to the prison's physician for review. On February 8th, 1967, Earl petitioned to the pardon board. Again, it was denied. Warden Mark Maxwell said Earl wasn't eligible for parole from his first murder conviction until a week later. In the petition, quote, "Boan asked that the second sentence be commuted so that he could be paroled and sent to a mental institution for treatment," end quote. He remained in segregation until March 16, 1967, when he was transferred to 5 House. On May 17th, he wrote a letter to Captain Howard saying, quote, "Why are you prejudiced against me if I'm in the wrong? I wish both of you would tell me. No one has told me how much time I've got to do. I've only been in Five House 5 times in 11 years. I've made up my mind to stay out of Five House. Please put me in 2 House or 1 House. I prefer 2 House, but if I have to go to 1 House," end quote. He transferred back to the 1890 cell house on June 21st. The next day, the disciplinary board returned him to Five House. Warden wrote on August 17th that Earl requested a return to the 1890 cell house. Earl promised to memorize the inmate's new rule book. With all the cell time, Earl couldn't shed his weight and was having trouble with his knees, elbows, and shoulders. Throughout the summer and fall of '67, he bounced from the 1890 cell house to 2 House, 5 House, and ended back in 2 House by December. On May 29, 1968, Earl was moved out of Five House and given the job as the deadline janitor by Warden Stiles, raking and cleaning the deadline. On June 16, 1968, Earl was taken to the prison infirmary, claiming he was struggling with a stomach ailment. When authorities and attendants left the room, Earl opened a cupboard and removed a bottle of pine oil disinfected floor cleaner. He drank about a quart before attendants could stop him. About 9:30 p.m., he went into convulsions. We have an oral history from Dennis Clark from April 1982 talking about serving as a nurse attendant who witnessed Earl's death.
Really, no, I know guys that cut themselves. There's a guy that eventually ended up dying named Earl Boan, and Earl Boan used to cut himself all the time. Wherever he was at, he'd cut himself up once in the hole when I was there. He was a nut. He'd kill some Mexican there named Blanco. And then he finally got out of the hole. He'd done years locked up. And he died. He died there in the hospital, killed John. Drank pine oil. And they popped his stomach out and everything. But they had him in the hospital. He threw up in his sleep. And he had him shackled to the bed. And when he vomited, he threw himself, and he fell out of bed. When he fell out of bed, he broke his leg. And the man weighed over 250 pounds and couldn't turn him over. And he strangled to death. And I was there. I was working in the hospital, and he strangled to death in his own vomit. Because there was 3 of us. We couldn't turn him over. And the officer wouldn't unlock his leg. He was sitting there. The officer wouldn't unshackle his leg from the bed. Because when he fell, he twisted and actually broke his. You can see it broke. When the officer, he wouldn't unlock the chains from him because he was his name. Do you remember? J. Ball. The officer? Yeah, J. Ball. And because he never had the authority, he had to go to his superior or whatever. And the time he got that done and got back, the man was dead.
So Earl had been strapped to the gurney to prevent him from doing any more self-harm or harming anybody else, and he began to vomit and convulse. And the gurney flipped on its side, breaking one of his legs as he choked on his vomit. The officer on duty was new and didn't think that he had the authority to remove the shackles on Earl's legs. The men witnessed him choke to death on his vomit. Earl's body was transferred back to Thomasville, North Carolina, where 2 funeral services were held. He was buried on June 20th, 1968. Now, in the clock in the following month, a poem was written titled The Kiss of Death, and it says, the editor's note, "Since the beginning of time, man has been describing death in an effort to overcome his fear of it. Man fears death," says Sir Francis Bacon in Of Death, "as children fear the dark. And as one fear increases, so does the other." The following poem, written by Dave Huber, is a little different approach and is an honest impression of what he and possibly others felt the day a friend of his chose death by suicide rather than life in prison. Described here is death tempered with suicide, which is even harder to understand. "Early one night, as I walked around, and life seemed to be so nil, the kiss of death, a lonely sound, came drifting down the hill. In the eyes of death I shy away. Life means so much to me, but to our friend Earl, who passed away, 'twas his last chance to be free. The kiss of death lay at his feet and held his life at bay. The kiss of death, so cold yet sweet, took his life away. We carried you slow and took great care. They watched us walk away. Your life had stilled, but you were there. Death on the stretcher lay. So here's to Earl, a friend of mine, and to the way he lived and died. In a caged-up world he did his time and swallowed back his pride. So, Earl, good luck, wherever you are, till someday we meet again. The kiss of death made you a star for reasons I can't explain.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm a little shocked that he had a friend who'd write that.
Me too. When I came across that, I was like, no way, this is wild. I've been going through for any deaths, trying to find, Ernesto Blanco. I tried to, in the following months after his death, to find any mention of it in the clock and couldn't find anything there. But I've been making it a point that anytime I find these, like to see if there's mention of these individuals in the clock. And yeah, it was, this is a heavy one, Sam. And I apologize. There's so much back and forth, but this was like the chaotic nature of this person's life and his time in prison. He's being bounced around and has no day-to-day, and he's clearly uncomfortable in his own skin. He's trying to take his life repeatedly, even in his juvenile years. There's probably self-harm involved there, and yeah, this young man who clearly needed to be incarcerated, needed to be away from society for all of our safety and protection. But I don't know what kind of help that they could have provided this guy. It's just such a dark story. And I knew going into this, I've not been excited to do this story. I wanted to clear up some things because a lot of our guides, we talk about individuals who were locked up in Siberia for 18 straight months. And, I had a hard time pinpointing that with any accuracy because all of his punishment records, he was, it was like 10 days in Siberia, 2 weeks in the cooler, back in one house for 3 days, and then back in 5 house for 2 more days, and then back to Siberia for a month, and then the cooler for 3 days, and then back into one house, and then to 2 house for a week. And then, so I tried to make a timeline, but there are a lot of gaps. So all of this is solitary. He is without his cellmate during all of this because it would be too dangerous for him to be housed with anybody. But it wasn't necessarily straight Siberia time that I could find throughout all this.
I think there are a lot of ethical questions we ask when it comes to corrections. How do we punish those who break the law? How do we have them repay to society what they took? The question is compounded when it comes to the mentally ill. And like you said, this is a circumstance where if this individual was serving in a hospital or an asylum, he would hurt people. He would kill again. And even if he's serving in the prison population, he would hurt and kill again, as he did. And so the question that remains is, how do you punish someone like this? What is the ethical way to have these individuals repay back to society because they're too dangerous to be left alone, and yet they're too dangerous to be left by themselves? I don't know. I think there's no real easy answer to that.
Even just the base of not having a light bulb in your cell. No matter what cell house he's in, that it's going to be in a dark room. So, trying to decipher his handwritten letters, it made way more sense when I finally got the timeline of what's happening. This person who's solitary, his mom visits one time, and during that time, there seems to be this really positive impact. He gets a job, he's working, he's let out to 2 yard, he's working in 2 yard doing janitorial work, he's in 4 house doing janitorial work, and then the darkness comes back after his mom leaves. And what do you do with these folks in society that are just too dangerous there's no chance of rehabilitation? And I happened to reading the records, seeing what he did to Pearl, he was too dangerous to be let out, and there was really not much to do for this individual other than, if there was a psychiatric hospital, a place where he could be treated and not just given tranquilizers, which I think is what was happening here, that he was actually given a proper medical doses and regular psychiatric evaluations and therapy. I don't know if that's something that could have helped him, but
Well, and it's not fair to Ernesto Blanco or the other prisoners who have to deal with the fallout with the individual who's too dangerous for the asylum, for mental health institution. Oh
man, yeah.
I think part of the point of the podcast is just being able to get a larger picture of someone's life instead of just these big moments in the life. And with this one in particular, it's a terrible story, but in some ways it makes his actions make more sense as moments and patterns. And you see these moments in which he throws away the knife that he was holding to plan to kill a guard. And he's having these internal battles that he's often not winning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll just kind of end this with my sources today. So I used, of course, oral histories that are located at the Idaho State Archives, digitized versions of the prison magazine The Clock, which are located also at the Idaho State Archives, as well as Earl's file located at the State Archives. Also use Ancestry.com, newspapers.com, a coroner's report from the Chesterfield County, South Carolina, hosted by CSIDIXI.org, titled The State versus the Dead Body of David Cornelius Boan. Super fascinating. Anybody interested in these coroner's reports, I had never actually read one before, that had a lot of interesting details. It also had police investigation and primary source witness statements in their collection. So that's where I got that information about Earl's father. And then the NCpedia site about the history of Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, and a Wikipedia article on the Montana State Hospital. You know, lots of files, so many newspapers. Newspapers.com was such an important research form here to track all of his movements and see him up in, Kellogg and in Montana and, Oklahoma, and seeing him get vagrancy charges around the country. Oklahoma, that one before his escape and attempting his life there, and, everything on the East Coast. So, yeah, it was a ton of digging and really tough to track. And then when he got here, thank you, Sam, for actually going through the over 300-page file and getting me the relevant documents that we can access. And this seriously took me so long, and this is definitely an episode I've not been looking forward to telling, but it was good to clear up some of those things and then really get to the bottom of this person's psyche in a way.
Well, what a story. I remember learning this one for our dark history tours, and it is dark. But great job, of course. So many details that I didn't know. And, yeah. Well, great job, Anthony. Great episode to kind of call a season finale, I guess.
Thank you, Skye. Yeah, I am so sorry to all you listeners. And, yes, please, Idaho Suicide Hotline, if anybody's having, any issues, if you just need to talk to somebody, dial that number. There is help for everybody, and thank you for listening.
More coming soon, not all of it this dark.
Yes. We have some fantastic stool pitching Sundays coming up.
Yeah.
So definitely
Saturdays.
Tune into those.
Are we changing them to Sundays now?
Wow.
Nope, you're right, Skye.
We have some fantastic stool pitching Saturdays coming up, so definitely tune into those. Those will be much more lighthearted, and thank you guys for listening.
And hopefully we'll be back sooner rather than later.
Yeah. All right, everybody, do your own time.
Do your own number.
We'll talk to you soon.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast app, and leave a comment to tell us what you thought of today's stories. Your feedback helps shape future episodes and helps new listeners find the show. To learn more about the cases we discussed and to see historical mugshots of the prisoners featured in today's episode, follow us on social media. You can join our Facebook and interact with Sam and Anthony at Behind Gray Walls Podcast, and you can follow us on Instagram at Behind Gray Walls Pod. Thanks for listening.